Hello, I'm Sientir, and welcome to the Patron Podcast, where I talk about a topic selected by my patrons over at patreon.com/Sientir. So, we had a tie, which happens sometimes. If you'd like to help make sure ties don't happen, go join my Patreon, I guess. But the two tying topics are, what is my favorite book of the Bible and why? And then thoughts on The Expanse. So, this is a TV show and a book series. I've seen the TV show. So The Expanse in general and Season 5 in particular, which I've seen somewhat recently. And how does it compare to other sci-fi properties like Star Trek? What do I think of adapting a story from a book to a TV show/film? And that last one's maybe a little bit hard to answer because I haven't, like I mentioned, read the books. So sometimes when I have these, one of them will be a fairly short thing to talk about, or at least something that I can talk about very in brief, and then the other one will be one that I can go to in a lot more detail. So I just want to quickly talk about what is my favorite book of the Bible and why. I don't really have one. There are a couple of sections that I really like. Ezekiel 18, that chapter in particular I like, where God's basically like, yeah, no, people should not be getting killed for other people's crimes, like particularly children should not be getting put to death for things that their parents did and vice versa, things like that. And then also that like people should be judged by who they are now, not who they were in the past. So if somebody was good in the past and they're acting wickedly now, they should be judged for the wickedness they're currently practicing, not the good that they did in the past, and vice versa. So if somebody did a lot of evil in the past and then they're doing good now, then they should be judged based on that. So I like that. I like Hosea, which talks about a faithful love and things along those lines. Do I have any New Testament books that I'm particularly fond of? That's a good question. Like, a lot of the challenge here is that I generally like most of the books of the Bible. I will say I have a couple that are least favorites, even though there are parts of, like, most of them I like. But 1 Corinthians and 2 Timothy, while I think there's a lot of good stuff in both of them, they both have issues in my mind of, and how do I word this? I guess bluntly, stuff that I think is difficult to try to interpret or understand that has a way that people go through them that seems fairly straightforward, or where people try to gloss over complexities to try to make a straightforward interpretation that I think has caused a lot of problems in the church over the years. So 1 Corinthians, for example, has a whole section about head coverings that is grammatically very strange and logically is inconsistent, because like it's very likely, and I've talked about this in a Geekdom of God episode that I might link, but where this is just one example, but where there's this whole section about head coverings that doesn't make any actual sense and is most likely a quotation that Paul is refuting from the Corinthians, but old languages, like when the Bible was written, didn't have punctuation marks, so we would just have to kind of like try to infer where quotations might be. And so stuff like that, I think, has caused a lot of issues in the church over the years. But that's the only reason why I'd consider anything like a least favorite in that regard. But yeah, a lot of the stuff I actually like tends to be like Old Testament, I guess. But let's go ahead and talk about The Expanse, because like I said, not really a favorite book of the Bible to really get into. So I really have enjoyed The Expanse TV show thus far, but like my thoughts. So this is one of those things where what happens is I kind of need to get my brain going on the subject. So I'll talk about it a little bit more generally. Let's actually talk about this comparison. My family's been watching through Star Trek. So we've watched, just to give context here, the original series, Next Gen, Voyager. We're most of the way through Enterprise at this point in time, and of course Deep Space Nine as well. And most of the movies. So one of the things that I'll say is that Star Trek and The Expanse are trying to do very different things. And I think this is something that's really interesting to examine. Any sort of speculative fiction property, speculative fiction, of course, for those who have not heard the term, is science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Any sort of stuff in that sort of category has a lot of room to explore specific things, and it has a lot of room to try to explore humanity at large, and to explore specific things as well. So some science fiction properties that do things very differently, for example, Bejeweled's, why am I blanking on the name of it? Verkozigan Saga. That one does a really interesting job of exploring, okay, humans have populated an area, but what it really does is, how is human society interacting in this phase, and how do humans interact with technology? That in particular, that last one, how do humans interact with technology, she does an excellent job with. And seeing, okay, how does human society interact with technological development, and how does that impact things? So that's exploring its own sort of thing. Star Trek is really trying to explore, okay, how can we use a hopeful picture of a future humanity where humanity's gotten its act together and everybody's acting more or less cooperatively, with alien species where that's not the case, right? Where there is conflict of some kind, whether that's political or even militarily. I don't know, whatever word I want there. But using that to be able to critique human society as it is now, like, that's a very specific goal that it has. And I think that's a worthwhile and interesting goal as well. And the Expanse is doing something else. And in many regards, the Expanse is looking at the worst factors of human nature, and trying to say, like, how do you strive against greed and tribalism? Because you have very strong tribalism, very strong factions. Like, in the real world, things are very complicated because we have a lot of actors at play, and there's a lot of layers of nuance. But in the Expanse, because it's simplified down to focusing on the sort of conflict between the Belters, which are people who live in space. They live in, like, the asteroid belt is where that comes from. But they live in space and space stations and spaceships and things like that. And the Inners, which is the sort of the reference to the planets. But Mars has been colonized, so you have the conflict between Mars, Earth, and the Belters. And there's different political tensions going there, but because it's distilled down in factions, very simply, in terms of having these three primary groups, it allows them to be able to sort of focus very highly and very intensely on the conflict between those groups. And there's a lot of very intense conflict, a lot of selfish in-group, out-group sort of thinking, where we have to take everything for ourselves or put ourselves in the most advantageous position to the detriment of others. And when everybody's doing that, it kind of is a no-holds-barred conflict. And then there's greed for, okay, how can we get the most resources for ourselves? And how do we try to hold on to power? It's a very brutal look at humanity in many regards, but it's also, like, got sort of almost an optimistic angle where it's like, okay, people can change, and in the face of great catastrophe, people can find themselves banding together, even if ordinarily they'd be at odds because of sort of their factional alignments. There's some of those elements in there, but it's always sort of a show, it's a show about scraping through by the skin of your teeth, where it's just barely making it through. And I think that's really interesting. It is handling this sort of topic in a very different angle. Star Trek is a lot more optimistic. The Expanse is a lot more pessimistic about the future. But it's not without its, like, pools of optimism. Like, the Expanse's premise in some regards is society is crap. How do we try to do something good in the midst of that? Like, how do we try to strive against the brokenness of society, to come together, to be a stronger group together, and to try to help these people not destroy themselves in their disagreements. So I think that's really interesting. It definitely is a show that, like, its pacing and structure is very different than what I think works well for Star Trek as well. I don't know. This feels like it's maybe almost a little bit more about the comparison angle, but I think that's interesting. Like, Star Trek, in my mind, works best generally when it's taking a much more, like, episodic look at things, where it's here's an episode of something. Like, when there's an overarching goal, I don't think it works as well unless they keep that goal very short in duration. This was something that has a problem with Voyager, actually. Overall I've enjoyed all of the Star Treks that we've watched for the most part. But, like, Voyager had this overarching goal of its premise of, okay, these people have been shunted way off into the middle of nowhere, effectively, to their, like, knowledge, like, outside of their realm of knowledge. They need to make their way back, And what does that look like? Well, it looks like they have an end goal. And so the entire thing is focused on this goal of getting home effectively. And that puts a lot of narrative pressure to try to like achieve that goal. And I think Star Trek works better when it doesn't have that sort of pressure, when it's about exploration and discovery rather than obtaining a goal, if that makes sense. And I think that tends to be when Star Trek's kind of at its best. The Expanse is very much so like about having that pressure. It's about having that tension. It's about like catastrophe is constantly around the corner. And so that sort of difference to me is really interesting too. And I really like that there's space for that. In terms of like adapting a story from a book to a TV show and or a film, I think this is also an interesting thing to kind of talk about. And I've gone, I don't know, where's the time? Yeah, decently so far. Adaptation is really tricky because what you want to do with adaptation, first of all, you can't just do a 1-for-1. It just doesn't work. There's a lot of reasons why. The tools that you have available to you in different mediums is a huge part of it. So I would broadly categorize mediums like TV and movies are very similar in that they're working within sort of the same framework, but with different constraints, if that makes sense. So movies typically have a larger budget, and they have a larger or longer time in an individual thing, but less time overall than a TV show. So like the pacing and everything is differently structured, but the tools that they have access to by and large are very similar in terms of the way that they tell narrative things and use a visual, like an audiovisual medium, but an audiovisual linear medium. Whereas like a video game, for example, it has that same audiovisual aspect, but it also is non-linear. It's something that somebody has control and input in because of the playing aspect, and the interaction allows for it to be an experiential medium as well. Whereas books do not have that audiovisual part, but they have greater freedom because of that in regards to the ability to highlight specific details. But it also means that it's hard to call attention, or it's hard to include details that aren't relevant. Like, so a movie or any other visual medium can have something that is part of the storytelling and world building that's kind of just there. You can have like the Chekhov's gun, right? Where it's like, oh, you have the thing hanging on the wall that will become relevant later, but you don't have to call attention to its existence by describing it being there. Whereas a book, when you include those details, like they're not something the audience will not notice because you have to kind of make mention that they're there. So like there's some difference in stuff there. But one of the bigger differences is interiority. Like in a written medium, you can get somebody's thoughts, right? You can get what's inside their head much more easily than you can in an audiovisual medium. Like you can still do an audiovisual in a movie or whatever, but it tends to be a lot more awkward because you have to have somebody narrating or you have to have some other way of like conveying thoughts. It's clunkier. And so it's much easier to deliver perspective in a written thing. What this means is that when you are adapting from one medium to another, you have to take into consideration what sort of those limitations and strengths are. And that's really, really tricky. And I think I don't know how The Expanse is done at that, obviously, because I haven't read the books. There's also differences in the audiences and how those are made up. Like the best one that I have as a comparison for this is actually the Lord of the Rings series, or the Lord of the Rings books and the Peter Jackson films, because I've experienced both of those. Where like I do think Peter Jackson did a really good job of adapting as he like in the manner in which he is doing it. I think like you need to streamline that, but there's a lot lost in that process too. And it would have been, and this is the constant problem, right? Because fundamentally what you're doing when you're crossing mediums like that with a property is you're trying to capture like a Venn diagram of audience. So there'll be people who will like the original thing better, and there'll be people who like the adaptation better, and then there'll be people who enjoy both. And what you're trying to do is you're trying to capture the people who will be interested in the adaptation as well as some new audience, realizing that you're not going to be able to satisfy everyone. And this is one of the things that I think is especially difficult, is recognizing that some amount of that original audience is going to be alienated, and there's no way to avoid that happening. Because the problem is, if you try to appease the original audience too much, you'll end up making something that like doesn't work well, or bounces off of the new audience to an extent as well. Like, yeah, it's a very tricky business. I think the thing about the Expanse's adaptation that I most admire is that the original authors of the book series are, from what I've seen from behind the scenes stuff, heavily involved in the Expanse TV show, and they also recognize the ownership that happens when somebody starts acting in a role. That these characters are like it. They're treating it in the very collaborative process that it is, and I think that's really important. And that's something that I greatly appreciate. I don't feel like I've said anything in particular here, but just talking about the difficulties of adaptation. But I guess that's some general thoughts on it. I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap up here. So if you've enjoyed this, I thank you very much for watching it, and I hope that you've enjoyed it. You can support me at patreon.com/Sientir, and any support you give there is greatly appreciated. But until next month, thank you all very much for watching. Thank you to my patrons for the support. Until next time, everyone, take care and goodbye.